The Focke-Wulf 200 Condor had a history that was as varied as it was filled with misfortune. The interwar years saw the rapid development of commercial aviation, from the flimsy, wooden fabric and highly flammable biplanes of the 1910s and 20s, into the sleek, all-metal and slightly less flammable monoplanes that would become associated with the golden age of aviation. Several pioneering long-distance flights had proven to the world that long-distance commercial air travel was the future. Initially, these long-distance flights were mostly done by seaplanes, as the long stops along the way often lacked the appropriate landing facilities required, and landing heavy, complicated machines carrying fuel and people on rough, uneven terrain often produced undesirable results. But by the mid-1930s, the trend had begun to shift. However, in a seaplane-dominated industry, it was still considered an unusual concept when Kurt Tank of Focke-Wulf proposed a land plane to Deutsche Lufthansa, an all-metal, four-engined monoplane capable of carrying passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. Much like the geopolitical spheres of the world in the mid to late 1930s, the development and service life of the Condor got very messy very quickly. The first prototype, designated V1, took to the skies just 1 year after development began on the 27th of July 1937. Production began in 1938 with the Focke-Wulf 200A. They would then follow up with the more powerful, heavier Focke-Wulf 200B and the 200D that had even more fuel for longer commercial flights. To make long-distance flights economically viable in terms of fuel consumption, the Condor was designed to cruise at an altitude of around 10,000 feet, or as high as comfortably possible for passengers without the need of a pressurized cabin. This cruising altitude required the aircraft to have a very long wingspan, at least comparatively for the time, which earned it the nickname Condor. These characteristics had the side effect of making the Condor, a commercial aircraft, rather attractive for military use as well. Despite being known for their use in Germany and their military use in the Luftwaffe, it was actually Imperial Japan that first considered the Condor for military applications. In 1937, the first prototype had flown from Berlin to Tokyo to demonstrate the long-distance capabilities of the new airliner, and to continue the trend of metaphorical bridge building between the two nations. The aircrew themselves having the honour of being received by Emperor Hirohito upon their arrival to Japan. Along with Japan ordering commercial versions of the aircraft, a request was made by the Imperial Japanese Navy for a military version of the Condor, as they needed a long-range, high-altitude aircraft for maritime search and patrol duties, and it made more sense to order a ready-made design by a friendly nation than to spend precious time and resources developing your own. Unfortunately for the Japanese Navy, they would never receive their Condors. The same prototype that had flown from Berlin to Tokyo was on its long way home and on approach to a stopover in Manila when all four of its engines decided to stop working. The Condor was designed to fly on just two engines in an emergency, but being relegated to an oversized glider had never been part of the design plan, and the aircraft briefly attempted and failed to become a seaplane. Whilst conflicting stories for the cause of the accident were a cause for concern, one source claiming a fuel pump failure, another that a fuel line had broken, and a third saying that the crew had selected the wrong tanks, the main reason for Japan not getting its Condors was in fact the outbreak of the Second World War. For Japan, Kurt Tank had modified a Focke-Wulf 200B1 to create the new 200V10 prototype, with more fuel, which added weight, 3 machine guns, which added weight, a short ventral gondola with fore and aft gunning positions, which added weight, and a lot of additional equipment, which surprisingly added weight. This is something that would come back to haunt Focke-Wulf rather quickly. However, at the beginning of the war, only 2 Condors were in service with the German military, and both of them were as transports, one being Hitler's own Führer machine. However, by the time of the Norwegian campaign, there was a pressing need for a long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft that had to be addressed. It was not so much the fact that the Luftwaffe had not foreseen this need, but that the one aircraft, the Heinkel 177, which was being developed for this role, was so far behind schedule that it would not be entering service until 1942. The Focke-Wulf 200 was the only aircraft that could be adapted in the short term for this role, and the Luftwaffe instructed Focke-Wulf to develop the Focke-Wulf 200 V10 prototype into a more robust aircraft with a bomb-carrying capacity. The result was the Focke-Wulf 200C series. Now, of the 10 planes in the initial pre-production batch, the first 4 were delivered as transport aircraft and the rest were armed. These pre-production units were delivered to the newly formed Kampfgeschwader 40 in Denmark before the end of the Norwegian campaign. Things quickly moved on to the C-1, which had the ventral gondola lengthened and added a narrow bomb bay to the airframe. It also had increased defensive armament, totaling 4 MG-15 machine guns mounted in various points, and a forward-firing 20mm cannon in the gondola. All of this added even more weight to the Condor. Despite adding structural reinforcements, hastily converting commercial aircraft for military use was bound to cause some problems, and the Condor developed the unhappy reputation of wanting to break its back every time it landed. 8 of the C-1 variants would be lost to this problem alone, making it rather unpopular amongst Luftwaffe ground crews. Despite that rather worrying structural issue, the Condor started to make a name for itself in military operations in support of the Kriegsmarine over the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, where, to its credit, it did rather well. One of the more publicised achievements of KG-40 was the attack by Oberlieutenant Bernard Jope on the 42,000-ton liner Empress of Britain off the north coast of Ireland on October 26, 1940, which left the large ship crippled. She was then promptly torpedoed and sunk by a U-boat. Jope was awarded the Knight's Cross, and later on he would go on to command KG-40 and receive the Oak Leaves as a major. From the middle of June 1940 to the first months of 1941, the Condors were reported to have sunk over 330 tons of shipping, prompting Winston Churchill to call them the Scourge of the Atlantic. That being said, the sinking of most of that shipping was only made possible by flying the bomber at dangerously low altitudes, so that the bombs were almost guaranteed to hit, as the Condor's low-altitude bomb sight was considered to be relatively primitive. In mid-1941, a change of tactics occurred. The heavy shipping losses prompted the British to develop the catapult aircraft merchant ship as a way to improve their defences against the combined Condor U-boat menace. On the 20th of September 1941, a Condor was lost when it attacked a convoy escorted by HMS Audacity, the first escort carrier. During the second voyage of the aircraft, 4 Condors were shot down. Although the Audacity was primitive and soon sunk by U-751, it announced the beginning of the end for this particular reign of terror incurred by the Condors. The vulnerable Condor was increasingly confronted by enemy fighters, launched from either catapult-equipped merchant ships or escort carriers, and the Focke-Wulf 200 crews were now instructed not to attack and to evade all combat unless unavoidable. They would then be used to report Allied shipping movements instead, the plan being they would guide the U-boats in towards the convoys they shadowed using a transmission of direct finding signals, but they would not directly communicate with the submarines themselves. To improve its anti-shipping effectiveness, the Focke-Wulf 200C4 was equipped with anti-shipping radars. Though advanced and highly praised, these modifications added even more weight to an already stressed and overloaded airframe. The C4 had a top speed of only 330 km an hour at cruising altitude, and it was even slower at sea level. It was a fatally slow pace, making the Condor easy targets for ship-launched Hurricanes. If set upon, the crew of the bomber had to completely rely on their defences, as even moderate defensive manoeuvres would cause the aircraft to rapidly disassemble, and it still had a habit of breaking up on landing. By the time even more improved models entered service in late 1941, they faced greatly improved convoy defences, boasting ship-launched aircraft and armed patrol aircraft such as Sunderlands and Liberators. Survivability fell, and over the next year the aircraft were called away to other theatres, mostly for transport and supply missions. However, there was one incident where a pair of Condors found themselves engaged in a dogfight against a B-24 Liberator. Admittedly, it wasn't the most graceful dogfight of the war, with one Condor sent into the sea, the Liberator performing an aquatic force landing, and then the second Condor crashing amongst some hedges later on in Bordeaux. But it was a dogfight nonetheless, and would have been quite the sight from the deck of HMS Highlander, which had observed the engagement. In 1943, 2 Condors were used as transports on the Eastern Front, flying supplies into the Stalingrad pockets. Losses from all causes continued to limit the number of Condors available for general operations, the aircraft simply not being adequately robust for operational load carrying and manoeuvres. More than 20 aircraft were to be lost as the result of wing spar failures alone. Such a loss was not insignificant in the total production run of about 250 aircraft. By this point in the war, the Condor was being replaced in the maritime patrol role by the Ju-290, but they were still being employed for anti-shipping strikes. In 1943, KG-40 began a new phase of attacks on convoys, particularly those sailing from Gibraltar to Britain. This is where the C-4 variant, with its anti-shipping radars, saw the most use. However, as the crews were under strict orders not to attack the convoys from below 10,000 feet, so as to avoid losses from anti-air gunnery, scarcely any worthwhile results were achieved due to the poor accuracy of bombing from this altitude. Before the end of 1943, KG-40 started to receive the new Focke-Wulf 200C8, which made use of Germany's new anti-shipping missile, the Heinkel 293. But on their first operational sortie, the Condor had a run-in with a RAF Sunderland and was shot down. Further missions followed, but with minimal success, and with the loss of their airfields following the Normandy invasion, the Condors were pulled back to Germany. They would continue to serve until the end of the war, however only as personal transports and supply aircraft.